Hello, listeners, and welcome to another exciting episode of Standing Post. I'm your host, Cody Starkin, and for those new to the podcast, I take you on a journey to learn about the people of the Secret Service and the jobs they do for the American people. For this month's episode, I interview a guest from our Counterfeit Currency section under the Criminal Investigative Division. The Counterfeit section is dedicated to stopping the illicit use of counterfeit currency in the U.S. Now, please welcome to the show, Miss Amanda Moffett. Welcome, Amanda, for coming on the show to speak about counterfeit currency with me and the listeners. And I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day. And so before we kick off the topic today, do you mind introducing yourself to the listeners?
Yeah, of course. My name is Amanda Moffett. I'm the supervisory document analyst in the Counterfeit Forensics section within the Criminal Investigative Division of the Secret Service headquarters building.
Awesome. And where do you come from? Where do you call home?
Actually, Northern Virginia. So I was raised overseas. My parents were foreign service.
Okay.
So got to travel around and explore the world that way. And then came back for graduate school, middle school and high school, graduate school. And eventually didn't really leave anywhere. Just stayed here.
What countries did you visit of note?
I grew up in West Africa.
Okay.
So Morocco, Senegal, and Mali was where I called home for 14 and a half years.
I'm actually curious, because of the line of work you do, working with counterfeit currency. You talked about coming back to the States and doing your master's program. What kind of educational track leads someone into the job that you do today?
So I went to an all-women's undergrad college, Sweetbriar in Lynchburg, Virginia, and I was really interested in forensics ever since I came back to the States. I think it was probably that CSI effect where everybody watches those forensic shows and
Yep.
It all looks really glamorous. In real life, not so much as glamorous as they portray on TV, but still it kept my interest. And so I did a kind of a shadowing with one of my family friends, had a pathologist connection. And so I tried exploring that avenue because I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do. And I thought it was awesome. I came back to my grandma's house and told her all about the dissection of a brain. She was very receptive to it, surprisingly, but it was just something that I found an interest in, except then I realized you had to go to medical school and you had to deal with people who were still alive before you dealt with people who were dead. And that was not for me. So then I pursued more of a science background because my undergrad, so Sweetbriar, did not have a forensic program. And I was like, well, how can I do this without completely taking it out of the equation? Like I was really interested in it. They didn't have a good network system established at that point with people in a forensic career. So I kind of had to navigate it my own way, figure out the path that would work best for me. I ended up majoring in biology, minoring in chemistry and mathematics, and then took a year off because I wasn't sure if I really wanted to do forensics. I was exposed to that CSI effect and was thinking like, okay, maybe it's just something that I think is cool on TV, like I said before. And then so I went back to Illinois, which is where my parents are currently residing, took that year off, and then decided I really did want to do it.
So I was going to ask, what was that kicker?
I was originally thinking I wanted to do crime scene investigations. So I tried applying to like Cook County, which is it's the county in Chicago. And I realized I didn't have the right kind of experience to pursue a career that I thought was really interesting. And so then I was like, oh, well, how can I do that? At that point, I was still honed in on crime scene investigation. So I went to George Washington University. It was a really big school. Sweetbriar only had about, I think it was like 600 students at the time. And then I went to GW and it was a big city and it was just massive. And I was so happy I was a grad student there and not an undergraduate student. So I did crime scene was my focus.
Okay.
Went through school, really liked it. Had an opportunity to intern at the Arlington County's police department in their robbery homicide unit. One of the detectives was actually is the husband of my current supervisor.
Okay.
My current supervisor was the one that initially hired me as a stay-in-school when it was a stay-in-school position. So
can you kind of explain that? Sorry.
Yeah. So the stay-in-school program, I think, has transitioned to the Pathways program, if I remember correctly. So an older version of the Pathways program. And I got my foot in the door with my boss, my current boss, who at the time was also my boss.
Okay.
And I was able to kind of learn the ropes and figure out, I was exposed to a lot of different options. I actually started in the forensic services division. And I saw that there was an application, or there was vacancy for a document analyst. And so I applied and I went through the interview process and I got the job. So
Awesome.
that it really was. It was very satisfying knowing that I had worked that hard. My parents were very proud of me, which mattered a lot. And then I was also just very proud of myself that I had actually found kind of an area that I was interested in. And I'm still technically a document analyst. I'm just in a supervisory role right now. So that kind of takes some of the casework out of the mix. But aside from that, I still love my job. I still wake up every day excited to go to work. And it checked all the boxes. Like I had said before, I love putting puzzles together. I love figuring out the mystery to it. And now it's not, the crime scene where you're picking up the little scraps of whatever is left on the ground from the crime, but it's more taking what the agents have found during searches or during their investigations and helping them piece together the puzzle, helping them provide an answer to the ever-eluding question that may be haunting them. So it's very satisfying.
Thank you for sharing your life story, your experiences with us and the listeners. And so I think that's a perfect kind of segue. Just one to say, I think you're the perfect candidate to be on the show to talk to us about what our current topic today about counterfeit currency. And so I do want to talk about kind of the what goes on today, what your position is and what you do for the agents a little more specifically later. But I kind of want to start off with like setting the stage for the listeners, because in past episodes, we have kind of talked about it. We've alluded to it, but we've never really sat down and talked about the history of counterfeit currency. So I'd like to maybe start off with that, because that's kind of our bread and butter here and why the Secret Service started. But I'd like to let you provide that history about counterfeit currency in the U.S. Secret Service.
I guess the starting point would be during the Revolutionary War. There were so prior to the Revolutionary War, the United States was trying to figure out its identity. So there were a kind of a whole assortment of different kinds of currency designs floating around out there. There were lessons learned. So constant evolving changes in our currency design. The structure, financial infrastructure of the United States was still being established at that time. So there were opportunities galore for counterfeiters to run amok, run wild. So during the Revolutionary War, one of the types of currency designs that was issued was the Continental currency. The Continental currency was actually produced using a typographic or letterpress print process. That's how newspapers were printed back in the day. So it was an impression type of process where you have the plates and they make contact with the paper. And there's not a lot of security behind that kind of print process. It opened the door to the British coming in and saying, okay, this is a good opportunity. There's some vulnerabilities to that currency. So they essentially attacked it and started introducing counterfeit into the structure, the circulation process. And their hopes were to kind of formulate an imbalance in the financial system.
Okay.
Start bringing up to question, because when people start to question your currency, that's when you've got a problem. So we rely a lot on the public trust of our banknotes and our currency infrastructure. So that's one thing you definitely don't want to introduce, is that moment of question where somebody goes, is this real or am I looking at a counterfeit? So the problem was during that Revolutionary War, the Continental currency was it was a failure. And so there is a saying it's not worth a Continental. And that was the public's way of saying, we don't trust our banknotes.
Okay. So is that a popular term at the time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So when I did my training, because we do have to go through an apprenticeship program in order to become a certified document analyst. Yeah. So when I did my training, because we do have to go through an apprenticeship program in order to become a certified document analyst. And it varies. So in Forensic Services Division, I did my certification on on traveler's checks, other documents, writing inks, toner, paper. That was my specialty. So when I came up to CID, Criminal Investigative Division, and started working in the Counterfeit Forensics section as a document analyst, not as a supervisor, I had to learn about banknotes, and I had to learn about the history of banknotes. We had to learn about the different style designs of banknotes, because it's not all the same style that we're used to seeing these days. There's been a progression in time.
Do you have a specific, during that training, was there anything that kind of threw your guard off where you're just kind of like, oh, how'd they get away with that? Was there something in that training that stuck out?
Well, so aside from learning about the history, you get to actually experience and look at cases as they come in and kind of get a feel for what the general day-to-day activity will be like. So we get that exposure to the whole gamut, from fairly decent counterfeits that are printed using intaglio print process, offset print process, to inkjet banknotes that don't have any simulated features. So I would say that we get to see that range, and the good, the bad, and the really, really bad, or you could call it the ugly. But with learning the history part of it, that's where you get to kind of learn those fun facts about, well, okay, I've heard that saying, it's not worth a continental. But how did that come about?
Okay.
And it was because of the lack or the loss of the public's trust with our banknotes. And so that was an interesting way to kind of, for Britain to impose themselves into the mix and try to destabilize the government system. And then also when we got to the Civil War part of history, we had issues where about 1/3 of all banknotes in circulation at that time were counterfeit. So huge problem.
Yeah, definitely. No, of course.
That's how I would vision it. I would say there needs to be something done about it. And so Abraham Lincoln, we were very fortunate, came to this idea that there needed to be an agency dedicated specifically to, suppressing the counterfeits. He recognized the problem of 1/3 being counterfeit and came to actually develop the Secret Service. He reached out to the Department of Treasury and said, hey, I want to make an agency or develop an agency that is going to be assigned strictly to, like, their mission is going to be suppressing counterfeit.
Or was it just bad actors taking opportunities to create their own?
It was more opportunistic.
Okay.
There weren't security features in our banknotes. So Benjamin Franklin had the idea of implementing leaf patterns in banknote designs, because if you think about the veining pattern in a leaf, it's much like a snowflake, and no two leaf vein structures are actually alike. So he was looking at that going, okay, well, it's a good security. You can do something like that as a security feature.
Okay.
And so a lot of our historical banknotes have leaf designs on them, or some sort of organic structural design on them.
Okay.
So it's actually pretty neat when you come and like look at banknotes laid out in front of you, the historical ones and their progression through. You get to see some of those. You're like, oh, okay, I've seen that leaf design, and that makes sense now.
I know within the Secret Service, we do have a vault that contains a vast array of counterfeit currency notes of note. So I was going to ask, like, what is our oldest one that we have currently within the vault?
I mean, we've got an assortment of historical banknotes. So I would say we have some United States notes. We have national currency banknotes. That vault that you're speaking of is actually in my section. And we are responsible for maintaining the counterfeits that come into the Secret Service, and we record them appropriately. And then we also obtain reference samples of genuine banknotes, because you can't call something counterfeit unless you have a genuine specimen to compare it against. And that's a rule of thumb for all authentication type of examinations. You need to have that specimen for comparative purposes. So we are constantly in communication with the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. And whenever they release a new banknote design or even a new series year, that's just a numeral, like a date change. That is where we will get specimens of those to add to our library. And then if necessary, we can disseminate those genuine specimens to field offices, so that then they have reference samples too, because the agents out in the field are certified and able to call something genuine. But we also want them to have the comparable specimens to actually make that call.
Yeah, because I would assume that some of the counterfeit that you have received, you need that kind of that delta or that difference, so that like even if there's like a minute change, you're able to, at least from a visual aspect, still like see that difference. I'm just putting it together in my brain. So
no, that's fine. That's absolutely what we do. Is we do a side-by-side comparison, and we look at the features, whether they're present or absent, and if they're present, are they the actual genuine features that you would expect to see, or did somebody counterfeit them or simulate them? And then to what degree are those counterfeited and simulated?
You had mentioned it before. So you were talking about being able to, I guess, bear witness to the history of counterfeit and seeing the different changes over time, and how far people have gone, how short people have gone to counterfeit notes. Can you talk about maybe one of the instances in the past of like how far somebody has gone specifically to counterfeit a U.S. currency?
Yeah, so I'm sure people who are listening are probably very familiar with the Supernote. At least that was the media term for it.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a country-sponsored counterfeit. So if you think about the financial abilities of a country, they have limitless expenses. They can spend the money on whatever it is they want to spend the money on.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, they spent the money on the materials that could do a very good job at counterfeiting our security features, including the paper. So there was an alarm, I would say, of, okay, now we need to redesign our banknotes. We need to take it to that next step and actually fight the fight. Not that we haven't been fighting it in the past, but just really ramp up our actions. So I would say that Supernote was probably one of the banknotes that, when I've been looking at them, they do a decent job. I mean, I can pick out the differences, but a person off the street, like the public, you can't. That would be one of those banknotes that I would not expect somebody to be able to outrightly determine genuine versus counterfeit. They do get caught at the Federal Reserve level. They can also be caught at bank institutional levels like that. So it's not a complete threat, but at the same time, it was enough of a threat that it needed to be addressed. And it was.
Was it something that spurred the next development cycle for the next U.S. currency?
Yeah, so we actually redesigned for security. That's one of the mantras that the U.S. currency program follows. We don't redesign for aesthetics. I mean, yes, aesthetics matter, but security is our foremost concern. And so during the Supernote era, which was the early 1990s, there was that need to constantly stay ahead of the counterfeiter. We needed to, and I say we, the U.S. currency program and those involved in the redesign process had to sit down and either figure out an approach, a way to answer those problems, those current threats. And it was redesigning the banknotes. So we went from a small portrait, 1929 style is what the service calls it, banknote, to not just taking the simple one focus of fibers, red and blue security fibers is the only feature that you found in our first iteration of small portrait banknotes. I guess that I wasn't around during that time, but my understanding is there was that need to add additional security features, but they didn't want to change the design overall. So it was implementation of microprint and an embedded security thread. Lessons learned during that process was maybe make those features denomination specific. So vary the location of those features. The next iteration of redesign, because we still had the Supernote issue, and these counterfeiters were staying on top of all of it too, which is also a tough task for us, because you're constantly, that's what you want to do. You want to stay ahead of the counterfeiter. You don't want the counterfeiter keeping up with you. So the redesign in 1996 occurred, and we refer to that as the 1996 style banknote. And that was enhancement of the microprints and the embedded thread. So we made them denomination specific. And then we also added a watermark, and we added optically variable ink. And that was a color shifting ink in the lower right corner. So, and then we kept the red and blue fibers. Our red and blue security fibers are throughout all of our banknote designs. And we still had a Supernote problem because they were attacking the 1996 style banknotes. And so there was a need to redesign the banknote and add more security features, as well as, technology advances very quickly. And you don't want to put some archaic feature on a banknote. You want to try to stay with the newest and the most complex type of technology. So there was that need to redesign a banknote. And so in 2004, the redesign occurred and we introduced our current design, which is the colored background banknotes. And those have the same five security features. So you have your watermark, your optically variable ink, your red and blue fibers, you have your microprint, and you have your embedded security thread. But then if you look at the 100 has a lot more security involved in it because it's our most valued banknote, highest denomination. And so then they added a blue optically variable thread, which is a motion thread. Some people refer to it as a 3D ribbon. Mm-hmm. Some people in the public, like some of my family members, have said, "Oh, it's the blue stripe that's down the center of the banknote." And I was like, "Okay, yeah, that's not really what it's called, but that works."
Do you twinge a little bit?
Yeah. It's also educational though, mm-hmm. because you're seeing how the public sees it.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
So learning, maybe I don't want to say their lingo, but learning how they approach it allows you to be more relatable to that individual. So you're like, okay, now that I know that the public calls it a blue stripe, maybe I will use that term depending on my audience. So you learn to kind of cater your audience, mm-hmm. The verbs or whatever it is that you're using, verbiage, to relate better with them. And then maybe they will actually tune in and pay attention to what it is you're saying versus speaking way ahead of, way above whatever their level would be. We try to come across as very approachable and just not more elite or mm-hmm. anything like that.
Sure. Where can somebody go to kind of better understand about the security features of banknote denominations that we have? Where can they go to find out that information?
There is a uscurrency.gov site, and that's managed by the Federal Reserve, and that's a currency education site. So it provides exactly what you had just asked, all the different factoids about security features, what's on our banknotes, the different styles. It's a very good resource. It also has some information as it relates to kids and teaching kids money, which I do think is very important. Familiarizing your kids with currency and how to handle banknotes and maybe what kind of just an overall what to look for. You don't want to inundate them, but give them little pointers.
Well, yeah, because if they're running around selling that candy that the schools put on them, you want to make sure that they know what money that they're receiving for those M&Ms and Snicker bars. So
yeah, the bake sales.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, and then we also have Know Your Money brochures, mm-hmm. which are available from the field offices. They would disseminate them to retail. They can disseminate them to public audiences that they give presentations to. There's the information on the Secret Service main pages. Mm-hmm. So those are easily accessible. So I would say those are probably the strongest resources out there.
The Secret Service had a program called Operation Quick Glance. Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Yes. So that was, I believe it was November of 2019, give or take. And it was an initiative by the Counterfeit Branch to reach out to the public and say, essentially the overall message was just take a look at your banknotes. It doesn't take long to just glance at a banknote. So hence the quick glance. Mm-hmm. Component of it. And the reason for it was not just to raise public awareness on banknotes, but we are having a very big issue with motion picture and foreign text banknotes. And they're the same size. They're printed front and back. And sometimes they look very similar to our genuine banknotes, but there are usually portions of the banknote that don't resemble what our current banknotes look like. So the portrait might have a smirk on it. They might be winking. There's one where Benjamin Franklin's smile, he has teeth, which is very disturbing, by the way. And so if you were to just take that quick moment and look at the banknote, and your eye generally gravitates towards the portrait and engages with the eye contact of the portrait, which I always thought was really neat. So there is rhyme and reason behind the, institution of a portrait on the banknote. But you would notice that. You would see like, oh, Benjamin Franklin has teeth. That's very unusual. The banner, instead of it saying the United States of America, would say for motion picture purposes. You have Chinese characters, foreign text on your banknotes that are not on our current genuine banknotes. They're not on any of our genuine banknotes, by the way. So that was the big message. And then we also took that opportunity not only to say, look at your banknotes, just a second, but to use it as a educating forum as well and say, hey, these are the 5 security features that we recommend you can look at in our banknotes. And by the way, if you hold up a banknote to a light source, whether it be your office light or outside in a normal daylight setting, you can see a watermark and you can see an embedded thread. So it's like a 2-for-1 kind of deal. That overall was the purpose of that messaging. They released it on the nightly news right before the Thanksgiving holiday season. So Black Friday was kind of the target point because that's when merchants are most vulnerable. You're going to have a slew of people. You're going to have those crowds. You're going to have the time crunch of processing transactions. So they just wanted to say it's okay to look at your banknotes.
And also, too, the feel. Isn't that another indicator, too?
Yeah. So there are some financial institutions, the tellers behind the windows will use that as one of their primary, like as you do the handover, you might notice that they rub their thumb over the coat jacket of the portrait. Okay. And what they're doing is they're feeling for that intaglio print. Okay. So intaglio is a really thick ink and it leaves kind of, if you want to think about ridges, it sits on top of the surface of the paper. So your fingers run across it and feel those bumps and grooves.
It's almost like an embossing-ish, or no?
It's not embossing, but the pressure applied during the process of printing it does leave impressions in the paper. So yes and no. Okay. But it's more the thickness of the ink. It's like a tar-like ink consistency. So if you think of tar sitting on the surface of your banknote and you think of mountains and valleys, a lot of times it's that kind of, that feel. So they're doing the feel for the intaglio. They're also feeling the paper because our currency paper does feel very unique compared to copy paper. And motion picture and foreign text banknotes are usually copy paper.
And so that's kind of where maybe in this last part is kind of maybe walking us through that process. So like somebody in private business or just an American citizen out there, they have counterfeit in their possession and they report it. What would that process look like going from there to potentially coming across your desk?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So if you find yourself in possession of a counterfeit banknote, so you either try to make a transaction unknowingly at a store and the person says, oh, this is counterfeit. You are stuck with it. But what you want to do is you want to reach out to your local Secret Service field office or resident office. And those points of contact are available readily online. And you would then kind of state your reason for calling, that you have a counterfeit note, and an agent would come out or make contact with you at some way, shape, or form and get that banknote from you. So you would probably just turn it over. Again, I'm a lab rat, so all of those little nuances that go into actually getting the banknote is more, I think, field specific. So they probably have their own way of doing it and their own policies and procedures around that. But ultimately that field office would get the banknote and then they would put it on a chain of custody form and they would send it into, if it's a new counterfeit, not of record, that is, they would send it into the counterfeit forensics section, which is where my team would be involved. And we would do our analysis from that point. There are financial institutions that also experience that same thing where they get stuck with a counterfeit. And they do the same process. They reach out to the field offices, the Secret Service field offices, turn over those banknotes. Now, the field offices don't have to send every single banknote to the counterfeit forensics section. They can hold on to them depending on what their office policies are. So then after a certain period of time, those banknotes would get destroyed because they're not of concern. They're already in records, so it'd just be making sure that they're recorded in the system, the stats are applied, and you move on. So we now have the Counterfeit Currency Processing Facility as well, which has taken that responsibility of getting the banknotes, and all the stuff gets just sent directly to the Counterfeit Currency Processing Facility. So now you've got financial institutions, retail merchants, public, just sending directly to a single point of contact, which probably makes life a little simpler. You don't have to search as much on the internet to find a location, a mailing address to send it all into. So that's kind of how it would work. We see suspect genuine banknotes. So if there's a banknote that is really worn and torn, has seen a good life, and the agents can't necessarily make a judgment call, because like I said at the beginning, they can authenticate banknotes. But if it's black or moldy, they might not be able to see some of the security features and just may not feel comfortable making that call. So they'll send in, we call them suspect genuines. So they'll send in those for authentication, and then we will run our series of exams and report back to them in a forensic report saying, hey, this banknote is genuine or this banknote is counterfeit, as well as provide them a little bit of a background as to why, what happened to the banknote.
Okay.
It got soiled or it got exposed to chemicals. So we can tell them that sort of stuff. With new counterfeits, which mean that they're not in our database system, then we are responsible for classifying that and giving it a counterfeit number. We file it in the library, that big vault that you were mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And we write up the technical data on it. So we look for defects, reproducible defects in the banknote designs. And that's important because it allows us to link banknotes to one another. So maybe counterfeiters share files. It is a digital era, so some images are readily available online. We have a wiki note. And if you can guess where the name came from, Wikipedia website. You can Google the 1996 style banknotes and you can get this beautiful image. Save the image, press print, you got a banknote. So we create those links that allow the investigative component to kind of get more information from just a single banknote.
Okay.
So it's really interesting. And that's where we come into play, is all of that classification and identification of counterfeit banknotes.
What specific aspects of this profession do you enjoy?
For me, it's a little bit of everything. So it's not just the puzzles, although the puzzles keep it really interesting day to day, because it's never the same thing twice. It's not repetitious. Paperwork can be repetitious, but the actual case itself and the banknotes are not. But also just learning about how it all comes together. And a banknote, when I first started, I was like, oh, it's a piece of paper with a picture on it. And I guarantee you that's how my husband looks at it. That's how probably the general public, it's a means of transaction, a financial back and forth. Now I look at it and I'm like, there's so much incorporated into a banknote. There's so much thought and processes and just the levels of security that go into a banknote. Full on appreciation for a new bank. It just wows me. But getting to learn some of the history and the company histories involved from the manufacturing standpoint, getting to work with the manufacturers, reaching out and learning from them, not just what their genuine processes are, but if we need to delve deeper and get the behind the scenes story of how something's produced, we have those resources available to us as well. So it's a big group effort.
And what does that process look like when developing a new currency form or design? Who collaborates on that?
So the U.S. currency program as it stands is a group of 3 agencies, and we all collaborate with one another. It's the Secret Service, Federal Reserve System, or the Federal Reserve Banks and Board, And then we also have the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. And that's both at DC and Fort Worth because there's two BEPs. And each brings a unique aspect to the table. So the Secret Service focuses predominantly on the security features and the security of the banknote because that's our mission. We are to secure the financial infrastructure and the payment systems of the United States. So I think that speaks pretty clearly as to why we're at the table. We look at the security features and we try to find out what their strengths are and what the weaknesses are. So that goes into the development of new banknote technologies, like new security features that are being brought to the table. We also look at another thing we bring to the table are the stats. So all the statistics behind the counterfeits themselves, what motion picture and foreign text, what the numbers are for those, how big of a concern are they? Because unless you provide that background, it can be easily dismissed or, overlooked as something that, hey, we need to raise public education. We need to make that an important forefront issue. We also talk about how the counterfeits, like what we're seeing in counterfeits. Are we seeing simulated watermarks, meaning are they printing the banknote watermarks on the backside of a banknote? Are they stamping them? That also goes into providing some enlightenment to, like, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing doesn't get exposed to the counterfeits. They don't see counterfeits. We expose them. We show them the counterfeits. And then their banknote designers learn from those counterfeits and go, oh, okay, so maybe the next technique that I need to do will involve a little tweak here, or, oh, let me add this little thing in here. So it's a lot of collaboration, a lot of sitting down at the same table and talking it out. And a lot of, for us, it's a lot of show and tell. Mm-hmm. And to be honest, I've never been in front of an audience that doesn't think counterfeit and genuine currency is boring. Everybody finds it interesting. Money is always interesting to people. Mm-hmm. And then the Federal Reserve System, they're the customers. They're the ones that take the banknotes that are printed and designed and circulate them around the world. So they have a say at the table. They talk about, like, their counterfeit numbers that they see at the Federal Reserve banks, because they have the massive processing components that authenticate banknotes, and decide if those banknotes are fit for recirculation, or if they needed to be taken out because they're worn and torn, or if they're counterfeit. So they provide numbers, and their numbers and our numbers kind of get married up to form an overall picture of what's going on in the United States and also around the world, because it's not just our US dollars are a worldwide currency. So that's another reason why it's very important to have those three agencies collaborating together in order to provide the most secure document possible.
For most of the episode, we had talked about just the actual, like, the paper currency and talking about the security features. But what about the coins? Because obviously the United States have coins, quarters, dimes, nickels. Have those ever been, and the penny. Sorry, I forgot that one.
And don't forget the penny.
No. Have you seen counterfeit coins come across, and are they still prevalent today?
So they are still an issue. They seem to be a very big issue for ports of entry. Secret Service is involved in those kind of investigations. A lot of times they work in collaboration with other agencies like Customs and Border Patrol, or the U.S. Mint will get involved, because the one thing that a lot of people confuse is who is the issuing authority of coins, who's the issuing authority of banknotes. So the Secret Service is not an issuing authority for coins. Our focus is on banknotes themselves. It's still part of the financial infrastructure of the United States, though, so we still have a vested interest in protecting from counterfeit coin concerns. We are trying to loop in the U.S. Mint for more of their expertise in this subject. My section, or the Counterfeit Forensic section, does not conduct coin analysis as of yet. We kind of lost that expertise years ago. And at that point, the coins weren't too big of an issue. So again, there wasn't that need for it. So we focused our attention on counterfeit banknotes more so. And so again, we usually pass on those cases to the U.S. Mint for their analysis because they are, again, the issuing authority and the experts on that particular material. But yes, it seems to be rearing its ugly head now more so than before.
And so as we wrap up the episode today, and we thank you again. I'm looking forward to having you back on the show, or anybody else from the counterfeit forensics section come in and speak about the various nuances of what you do or what the section does. But as we close out, I'd like to just leave you with the last word. Is there anything that you'd want to tell the listeners before we close out the episode today?
Actually, yeah. So just take that one moment to look at your banknotes. There are lots of security features in them, but also just looking at it very quickly, kind of like the quick glance campaign. If you just take a moment to look at your banknote front and back, or even just the front, you might notice some differences or some oddities in them that can prevent you from actually getting stuck with a counterfeit and then having to go through the process of contacting your field office.
For more information about the Secret Service or how to join, please go to www.secretservice.gov or visit us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Until next time, listeners, stay vigilant.